Alright, for my second article, I'm going to be reading Bilingual Education in the United States, a Historical Overview and Examination of Two-Way Immersion. Alright, and so it's starting on page 236. The percentage of individuals in the United States whose first language is something other than English has risen dramatically in recent decades. According to Census Bureau estimates, the number was 31.8 million in 1990 and 47 million in the year 2000, which is equivalent to approximately 1 out of every 5 people, or 18% of the population. Children constitute a large portion of this subgroup of the United States population. In 2007 and 2008, it was estimated that English language learners made up 10.7% of the public school student population. Over 5.3 million children. Wow, that's a lot. Okay. Further, the number of language minority children grew 53.25% from 1997 to 1998 to 2007 to 2008, compared to an increase of 8.45% for the general student population during the same time frame. The majority of these children come from families where the dominant language spoken is Spanish, which is 73.1%, though this is just one of about 150 languages spoken by students in U.S. schools. ELLs, partly due to the increased probability of living in poverty and having low parental education, often struggle in the United States education system, performing lower than their English-speaking counterparts in academic subject areas and on standardized assessments of math and reading. Now I am on page 237. Thus, effective ways of educating language minority children are desired to ensure that they are equipped with the tools necessary to become thriving members of society, of U.S. society. Bilingual education has long been a controversial topic in the United States, touching on multiple complex political, cultural, language, sociological, and educational, ethical, and identity issues. The current paper provides an overview of models for educating language minority children in the United States and shows the evolution of such programs with respect to significant historical policy developments and issues. Further, this paper emphasizes a promising bilingual education model that has been gaining popularity in recent years, namely two-way immersion. Researchers and educators face several challenges when discussing bilingual education services provided to ELLs. These include discrepant terminology and disagreement on definitions and different implementation of program models across states and regions. At a basic level, researchers and policymakers do not agree on the label for this population of children. Under federal law, these children are referred to as Limited English Proficient, or LEP students. However, this label has been criticized as focusing on what the child is lacking and drawing attention away from the value of the child's native language. To address this problem, contemporary researchers use alternative labels including English language learner, dual language learner, and language minority student. The labels used for services provided to ELLs also vary, with all kinds of different services being called bilingual education, for instance, programs in which ELL children are mainstreamed into all English classrooms, programs where ELLs receive instruction in both English and Spanish, and programs in which all students, both ELLs and native speakers of English, are instructed in both English and Spanish, are all described as bilingual education. This wide variability in educational services for ELLs creates difficulty for researchers and practitioners attempting to assess the effectiveness of these services. Bilingual education program models. Several approaches to ELL education have been implemented over the years, with varying degrees of success reported. These models for bilingual education can be thought of as on a continuum, depending on the relative importance that the program places on the native language of ELLs. There are 5 dominant models along this continuum that will be described in this paper. 1. Submersion. 2. English as a second language. English as second language instruction. 3. Early exit or transitional bilingual education. 4. Late exit, developmental or maintenance. I said that weird. Maintenance bilingual education. 5. TWI. And it does not say what that stands for, but we'll find out. The characteristics of each educational approach, as well as research findings on the effectiveness of each approach, will be examined. The first approach is known as submersion. With this model, ELLs are not offered any special language services, and instruction is entirely in English. This is often referred to as the sink or swim approach. Submersion programs were originally designed so that ELLs would pick up the dominant language as quickly as possible by being exposed to nothing else. Another version of submersion programs is structured immersion, where students are given native language instruction for a 1-year transition period and then move into all English classroom environment. Now I am on page 238. Much research has demonstrated that this model is not effective at helping language minority students to catch up to their native English-speaking peers in terms of English language knowledge and academic performance. Zeller, so one of their references, Zeller, showed about 11.7% of ELLs nationwide receive no specialized language services in school. This model is more likely to be found in areas with few language minority students, for example, rural areas of the United States, and or where resources for serving ELL students are quite limited. The next approach is known as ESL, or English for Speakers of Other Languages. Instruction. This model involves individualized instruction that focuses on acquisition of English language skills. However, in several school districts, ESL or ESOL instruction is the only type of service provided to ELLs. ESL pullout involves removing ELLs from the mainstream classroom for a portion of the day to receive individualized instruction with an ESL teacher. This method is more common in elementary schools. Once children progress to middle school, once students progress to middle school, the ESL class period is more common, where one class period is devoted to English language instruction for ELLs. Depending on their needs and the school's academic offerings, students may also attend some content area classes with their native English-speaking peers. Another model is known as ESL push-in, where an ESL teacher works with the ELL student in the larger mainstream classroom setting. This model of instruction can be very useful when several minority languages are represented within a school. The idea behind this program model is again to help ELLs acquire English as quickly as possible. However, unlike submersion, this model recognizes the need for individualized instruction to help ELLs catch up, but without any instruction provided in their native language. Research on ESL-only instruction has indicated that it takes children anywhere from 4 to 9 years to acquire English skills at grade level. This Zeller reference says that they did a study on services received by ELLs, indicating that about 60% of ELLs receive some ESL instruction, such as that described earlier. The third approach to educating ELLs, and the most common of the truly bilingual models where 2 languages are actually used in the classroom, is known as early exit or transitional bilingual education. And like the earlier models, these programs focus on helping ELLs acquire English as quickly as possible. Students are instructed in both their native language and English for a few years, but the use of the native language in the classroom is phased out beyond second or third grade. The reason for the fade out is the belief that students should not be too reliant on their native language throughout formal schooling, or they will not become fully proficient in English. Research with second grade students showed that language minority students in TBE programs outperform their counterparts in ESL only programs. This may be because students' native language competence was enhanced via the TBE program, which in turn helped them learn English. TBE programs are likely to be found in the school districts where the population of ELLs is smaller or the availability of bilingual teachers is limited. According to Zeller, about 20% of ELLs receive a fair amount of instruction in their native language, most likely in a TBE program. The fourth program type, known as the late exit, maintenance, or developmental bilingual education, differs from TBE in that ELLs receive a substantial portion of educational instruction in their native language, which continues for several years of schooling. Alright, now I am on page 239. As the label indicates, these programs developed due to growing recognition of the importance of maintaining the native language of ELLs. The goal is to develop both languages equally, additive bilingualism, so as not to lose language 1, but rather use it to support language 2. Research has found more positive results for maintenance programs compared to other program models. When comparing the performance of students in an English immersion, TBE or maintenance program, students maintain programs demonstrated higher academic performance. Further, Thomas and Collier argued that it takes 4 years at the minimum, but most likely longer, for a language minority student to attain grade level performance in English, depending on the student's background prior to beginning school in the United States. In light of these findings, a more intense bilingual education experience known as TWI has been gaining popularity in recent years. Before discussing this model, a brief history of bilingual education in the United States will be provided to show the gradual evolution toward TWI. A brief history of bilingual education in the United States, social and political evolution. The style of bilingual education offered to ELLs and views on the effectiveness of bilingual education in general have undergone much evolution in recent decades. In 1968, Congress passed an amendment under Title VII of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, known as the Bilingual Education Act. This amendment provided funds for the establishment of bilingual programs for ELLs. Originally, Title VII did not require schools receiving funds to actually use a second language in the classroom. Special interest groups and advocates began voicing concerns that the rights of language minority children under the Civil Rights Act of 1964 were being violated in terms of discrimination within the public school system. After much debate in the lower court systems, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in the landmark case Lau v. Nichols in 1974 that children who did not understand the language of instruction were being denied equal treatment in their school system. This decision significantly reduced the use of the sink-or-swim approach to education for ELLs and helped bring out further legislation to ensure that ELLs receive services to help them succeed. In more recent political history, Title III of the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001 contained language specifying that schools should have educational programs focused on developing English language proficiency for LEP students. The Act further states that these programs should be preparing LEP students for entrance into all English instructional environments. In a Congressional Research Service report for Congress, Quincy pointed out that the NCLB, or No Child Left Behind Act, also removes language in Title VII that encouraged bilingual instructional methods. This landmark legislation once again drew the nation's attention to acquiring English as the primary goal of bilingual education services, viewing native language maintenance as secondary. At about the same time, the English-only movement was gaining in popularity. For instance, House Resolution 123, known as the Language of Government Bill, passed the House in 1996 but failed in the Senate. Essentially, this bill would have declared English as the official language for the U.S. government, which was more significant What was more significant was the passage of Proposition 227 in California. This legislation, also known as the English for Children Initiative, banned the use of bilingual teaching methods and/or the use of a language other than English to instruct students in California public schools. Voters of California were given the option to choose to choose either the continuation of bilingual education programs in their state or to change the education model to a structured immersion approach. The structured immersion approach won in the polls. This approach provides language minority students with instruction in their native language for a maximum of 1 year. Following this year, the students are moved into mainstream English classrooms. English-only legislation like Proposition 227 disregards the importance of a student's native language in their educational experience. This movement comes close to placing language minority students back in the sink or swim situation in the area prior to the passage of the Bilingual Education Act. This movement also implies that the majority of English-speaking population knows what is best for language minorities in terms of educational experiences. Despite its passage, supporters of bilingual education were able to find loopholes in the legislation, allowing them to continue many effective bilingual programs in the state. For example, what was meant by teaching the school curriculum overwhelmingly in English was not specified, so some schools took this to mean that 60% of instruction in English was sufficient. Beginning in 2000, a 5-year longitudinal study began on the long-term effects of Proposition 227. About 600,000 children in California, including ELLs, 11 to 36.4% depending on the grade in the year, that was in parentheses, were assessed in various academic subjects. Researchers concluded that ELLs in California schools made some academic gains, but performance gaps between ELLs and native English speakers continue to persist. The researchers pointed out that it is difficult to determine the effectiveness of English immersion compared to bilingual education due to inconsistent definitions and difficulty with tracking individual students. Following the passage of Proposition 227, similar legislation was passed in Arizona, but with tighter regulations and fewer loopholes. Proposition 203, or English for the Children, passed in 2000. It has effectively led to the dissolution of many bilingual programs in Arizona, though some school districts again managed to find ways around the law. Massachusetts voters were given the option to effectively end bilingual education in that state, with Question 2, which appeared on the 2002 ballot. Massachusetts Section Laws, Chapter 386, was the reference for that. Once passed, this initiative ended bilingual programs and required ELLs to undergo a short period of English immersion, not to last longer than 1 year, and then be transitioned into all English classrooms. Supporters of bilingual education have turned to more comprehensive teaching approaches to demonstrate that bilingual education is indeed effective and has positive benefits for children. Thus, TWI programs, the last model discussed in this paper, emerged. Now I am on page 241, and it's talking about the two-way immersion, TWI program model. TWI programs use two languages to reach the same standard level of education as mainstream classrooms. The TWI program model is also known as dual language education, bilingual immersion, and Spanish immersion, depending on the partner language. And these terms are often used interchangeably, although the implementation of the program may differ slightly from district to district. TWI programs involve combining both native speakers of English, interested in learning in a second language, and language minority students in the process of acquiring English, in the same classrooms, learning throughout the day, taught in both languages. In the United States, the two languages most often involved in TWI programs are English and Spanish. This program is designed to help language minority students achieve additive bilingualism, as well as to help native English speakers students acquire second language skills in a natural way. TWI programs in the United States were modeled somewhat off the Canadian French immersion program for native English-speaking students, which started in 1965. The Canadian program showed successful academic results not only for language minority students but also for mainstream students. TWI programs can start as early as pre-kindergarten and most run for at least 5 years, some all the way through grade 12, but most TWI programs are found in elementary schools, which is the age range involved in most of the research discussed later, unless otherwise noted. The two most common models of TWI include the 90-10 and 50-50. In the 90-10 model, also called full immersion, students study subjects in the minority language through the second grade for 90% of the time. When they reach third grade, they transition to a setting in which both groups of children, ELLs and English speakers, receive half of their education in English and the other half in the minority language. Conversely, with the 50-50 model, or partial immersion, students have lessons half in English, half in the partner language from kindergarten forward. According to a survey conducted by the Center for Applied Linguistics, the 90-10 model is used in about 42% of schools that employ the TWI model, while 33% of the schools using the TWI model employ the 50-50 approach. The number of TWI programs have been growing rapidly since the 1980s. This is largely due to the sharp increase of foreign-born individuals in the United States. However, in areas where the majority of immigrants share a common language, for example Spanish, TWI programs seem to be much more in consideration, as one of the prerequisites for running such a program is to have enough students from the same minority language group to form half of the classroom. A student or a country where one ethnic group is already clustered together in a concentrated area, such as Chinatown in New York or Koreatown in Los Angeles, provides an easy inroad for starting a TWI program. As of 2010, a total of 372 TWI programs were serving language minority and native English-speaking students. With almost 10 different minority languages paired with English, TWI programs have benefited children from early elementary to high school across 28 states. Of these, California currently boasts the most TWI programs, despite the passage of Proposition 227. The uneven distribution of these programs across states is likely due to the relative location distribution of various ethnic and immigrant groups. Now I'm on 242. A recent evaluation of dual language programs viewed TWI programs as successful. The vast majority of the studies on the academic and linguistic outcomes of children who attended TWI programs finds positive results across developmental domains, language groups, and ages from preschool to 11th grade. The positive effects of TWI can be seen as early as preschool. In one study, 3- and 4-year-old children whose home language was either English or Spanish were randomly assigned to either TWI or English immersion preschools. The two groups were not different from each other in language, literacy, and math when tested in English at the beginning and at the end of preschool. However, the TWI group showed large gains in Spanish vocabulary compared to the EI group. This study demonstrated that young language minority students in the TWI programs can reach native-like proficiency in English, while improving in their home language as well, demonstrating that one can create an additive bilingual educational environment for language minority children even in the early childhood years. In a 3-year longitudinal study from 3rd to 5th grade, Howard, Christian, and Genesee, which is their resource, compared English and Spanish languages skills in writing, reading, and oral proficiency for 344 students from 11 TWI programs across the United States. Scores on writing, reading, comprehension, and oral proficiency demonstrated that both groups improved over time and in English and Spanish. However, native speakers of English made more progress in developing Spanish skills than speakers of Spanish did in English growth. But this gap in L2, which stands for, I forgot. It said it earlier in this thing. L2. I have no clue. And I can't find it. Alright. And now I lost my spout. Okay. However, native speakers of English made more progress in developing Spanish skills than speakers of Spanish did in English growth. But this gap in L2 progress between Spanish speakers and English speakers closed by the end of 5th grade. In this sample, the Spanish-speaking group was more likely to be in poverty, quality for free and reduced lunch, or they qualify for free and reduced lunch, and have lower maternal education than the native English-speaking group. Given that their analyses did not control for socioeconomic status, it is promising that Spanish speakers still performed as well as English speakers in the TWI program. Another study by Alanis examined the effectiveness of a TWI program with 56 Mexican-American 5th graders, 79% native Spanish speakers, and the rest native English speakers, compared with those who went to an English-only program. TWI children equaled or exceeded both English-speaking and Spanish-speaking participants in the English-only program on the standardized Texas assessment of academic skills. Studies have indicated that TWI programs are especially effective in promoting language proficiency, academic achievement, and positive attitudes towards school. TWI students not only reach a level of native-like English proficiency, hold on. What's wrong with my laptop? I thought I had storage and now I don't. Okay, Bianca, you got this, girl. How long have I been? 32 minutes. I want to cry. I don't even know. Studies have indicated that TWI programs are especially effective in promoting language proficiency, academic achievement, and positive attitudes towards school. TWI students not only reach a level of native-like English proficiency in both receptive and productive skills, but also maintain their first language competence more than students in submersion or ESL programs. A large evaluation of dual language programs was conducted by Lindholm Leary. She compared 18 schools, mostly in California, using 4,854 students across English-only TBE, 90-10, TWI, and 50-50 TWI programs from kindergarten through 6th grade. Oral proficiency in Spanish and English and academic achievement in reading and math were measured as outcomes. Teachers rated, now I'm on page 243, teachers rated students' English and Spanish oral proficiency in the spring. Schools administer different academic achievements tests, making it difficult to compare across schools. Thus, normal curve equivalents were used for standardized comparison. Both English-speaking and Spanish-speaking students in the TWI program, 90-10 and 50-50, showed significant growth in their L1 and L2, reaching almost near top scores for the language assessments. Importantly, English scores for native English speakers in TWI programs were at the level of those in the EO program. Spanish scores for native Spanish speakers in the 90-10 models were higher than those students in 50-50 and TBE programs. However, for L2 proficiency, native speakers of Spanish performed better than native speakers of English. Spanish speakers in TBE programs initially outperformed Spanish-speaking students in both 90-10 and 50-10 TWI programs on English assessments, but the students in TWI programs surpassed TBE programs students in English after 5th grade. Overall, results indicated significant growth in both L1 and L2 from kindergarten to 6th grade for the students in the TWI programs. In terms of reading achievement, students made significant progress over time both for L1 and L2, and progress differed by program types. English-speaking students in TWI programs scored higher than California state averages in English reading, and Spanish-speaking students in the TWI programs scored similarly or higher than California state students' average scores in Spanish reading achievement. However, low socioeconomic status Spanish-speaking students attended the 90-10 program performed below grade level in Spanish reading, just like Spanish speakers in TBE and EO programs. For native English speakers in 90-10 programs, high socioeconomic status students perform better in Spanish reading achievement than low socioeconomic status students. Spanish speakers in TWI programs lagged behind grade level for L2 English reading achievement, but they caught up by 6th grade. Finally, both English speakers and Spanish speakers in TWI programs were average in math, comparing their NCE to state criteria in L1, but the English speakers performed better than the Spanish speakers when tested in L2. Although students who were attending 90-10 programs received math instruction in Spanish until 3rd grade, when tested in English, they scored similar to students in the 50-50 models who received math instruction in English. Spanish speakers in both TWI programs performed better than those who attended TBE or EO programs, no matter which language they were tested in math for. Thomas and Collier argue that to promote the best developmental outcomes for ELLs, language, cognitive, sociocultural, and academic development should take place altogether both in L1 and L2 as opposed to taking place separately. Thomas and Collier conducted a longitudinal study from 1982 to 1996 involving 42,317 students. They generated a growth pattern of ELLs English language proficiency throughout 4 different bilingual programs: ESL, Pull-Out, TBE, Maintenance Bilingual Education, and TWI. The majority of the participants had up to 8 years of cumulative information, while students in the ASL program, Pull-Out program, showed the lowest performance of all the groups from kindergarten to 11th grade. Students in the TWI program were the most successful in terms of English language proficiency by grade 11. ELL started at the 23rd to 24th percentile in NCEs in the 1st grade, regardless of program type. The group differences emerged by secondary school. The students in TBE reached the 40th percentile by the end of 11th grade, whereas those in the TWI program reached the 61st percentile. Students in the ESL Pull-Out program progressed to about the 38th percentile by 6th grade, but their English scores fell back to the 24th percentile by the end of 11th grade. Now I'm on page 244. Thomas and Collier concluded that for language minority students, elementary school TWI was the optimal program for promoting long-term academic success. Those students maintained their first language and also developed their cognitive and academic skills while learning a second language. These studies, however, do not mention whether controls were in the place for ethnicity or socioeconomic status within the analyses. In TWI programs, being bilingual does not come at the cost of academic achievement. Children become relatively bilingual while maintaining academic performance as high as children in English-only programs. Most researchers agree that the immersion programs do not impede other academic areas such as math and history. Further, any fears of learning being delayed due to language confusion are unfounded. Thomas, Collier, and Abbott conducted an evaluation on an immersion program in Virginia. Academic performance of students experiencing the immersion program was compared to a group of similar peers not in an immersion program. Results indicated that after 2 years in the program, immersion students performed just as well as their counterparts on measures of academic achievement and cognitive ability, indicating that acquisition of the second language did not slow academic development. Immersion students actually outperformed their counterparts in certain academic areas, including English language arts. All right, limitations of two-way immersion program research. There are limitations in the research of the TWI programs, however. Despite finding long-term positive outcomes for ELLs in these programs, it may be too early to advocate strongly for nationwide implementation due to limited generalizability of findings and other methodological issues. First, there is a sample selection bias to consider. Many individual studies of TWI programs have small sample sizes, tend to focus on a low-income population, and do not randomly assign children to programs. Although the studies discussed earlier are some of the most rigorous and comprehensive evaluations of TWI programs, small samples result in low power and therefore less likelihood of finding statistically significant effects, even when a decent effect size may be actually present. Non-significant findings are less likely to be published, known as the file drawer problem, and this happens more frequently with small sample studies. It is important, therefore, to consider all studies conducted rather than just those published in academic journals. In addition, students in TWI programs do not represent a random selection of the population of public school students. Usually, both language minority students and majority students volunteer for TWI. Thus, it is difficult to know whether the success of TWI derives from the program itself or the characteristic of the students or parents who choose the program, or both. Also, the participants are nested in a similar social class, often low income, and a community composed in the same ethnic group, since the students usually come from a certain neighborhood. Therefore, findings may not be generalizable to different language minority populations in other regions of the United States. Okay, I'm on page 245 now. Second, many studies examining TWI programs lack ideal control groups. Several compared the progress of language minority children in TWI programs to that of language minority children in an ESL or English submersion program, finding that those in TWI are performing much better in most areas assessed. Studying language minority children in a similar but not quite as complex program, such as transitional or maintenance bilingual education, is needed as another appropriate control group. In addition, the language majority children in a TWI program should also be compared to an appropriate control group, such as English speakers in traditional EO programs. Third, measurement of academic achievement is often non-standardized. Although some studies are conducted within one school, others are conducted across multiple schools or school districts/states. Comparison between schools is an issue of the control group school because the control group school did not use the same achievement test. As a solution, most studies use a converted score such as the NCE, but this metric is limited across different assessments. Future research should endeavor to use the same assessments across program settings. Fourth, most examinations of TWI programs involve just one or two time points. As the few longitudinal TWI studies demonstrate, the significant effect of the program is not often apparent until the later grades of schooling, even though the program type typically begins in kindergarten. When the study is conducted in a relatively short time frame, it is rather difficult to find significant positive effects. Lastly, it is unclear whether researchers have taken into account the initial success of students when examining the effectiveness of TWI. All children, both native and non-native English speakers, represent an extremely heterogeneous group in terms of their language competence at the beginning of formal schooling. This initial difference influences outcomes of children's academic development and second language acquisition. Also, ELLs who receive at least some amount of formal education in their first language acquire English faster than those who do not have any experience of formal education in their mother language. Therefore, in order to assess the progress of children in TWI, researchers should control for and/or examine children's initial language skills in L1 and L2. Despite these limitations, students on TWI programs point in the same positive direction, and indeed dual language programs have gained in popularity. Considering that the program and research on it has emerged only recently, there is a lot of potential for the TWI model to grow and foster the educational success of both language minority and language majority children. Issues with implementing two-way immersion programs. Although TWI programs are gaining in popularity, this has only been implemented in 9 different languages, while there are over 142 non-English languages in the United States, excluding indigenous native languages. As of 2010, those languages that are used in TWI programs include Spanish, French, Korean, Chinese, Japanese, and German. The number of schools using a given language in a TWI program does not necessarily correlate with the most frequently spoken minority languages in the United States. For example, Japanese is not one of the top 10 languages spoken at home in the United States, and yet a Japanese English TWI program exists. Now I'm on page 246. Therefore, areas of the United States with large concentrations of a particular language group are more likely to have a TWI program in place, even if that language is not that prevalent in the rest of the country. A successful TWI program also requires physical resources such as classrooms and textbooks, trained personnel, instructors, and an appropriate curriculum. Staffing is counted as one of the most important factors in various studies. It is challenging to employ and/or retain good bilingual teachers. Another factor related to success of a TWI program is parent-home collaboration and attitudes and values and cooperation. When the school resides in a community that supports a native language, even if the school does not implement a dual language program, parents are more likely to seek out a way to educate their children in their first language and encourage them to use that first language. Finally, the effectiveness of TWI programs for both language minority and majority children also likely hinges on the equality of the social climate provided in the classroom, including successful cultural and social integration and collaboration across diverse types of students found in dual language programs. Schools that implement TWI programs are limited by geographic location. Given that the minority language that is most commonly spoken in the United States is Spanish, it is not surprising that states with a higher concentration of Spanish-speaking immigration populations have higher demand for dual language programs. Indeed, the majority of TWI programs are located in California and Texas, and only 28 states currently implement TWI programs. 93% of TWI programs around the United States have Spanish as their partner language. More schools utilizing a partner language other than Spanish are needed. A few other issues must be considered. Even among TWI schools, very few schools can span pre-kindergarten to 12th grade. Although a noticeable positive outcome is not really apparent until the elementary years, some studies show that effectiveness of TWI programs as early as preschool. Starting the TWI program as early as possible may be the key to successful outcomes. Also, the final status of the L2 learned for native English speakers attending TWI programs might be limited. In Alanis' study, only 53% of native English speakers who attended a TWI program became fully proficient in Spanish, as indicated by school-administered oral and proficiency tests, whereas 85% of the native Spanish-speaking students became proficient in English. Due to the limited settings in which English-speaking students are presented with the second language, they might not be able to develop full usage of the new language outside of the classroom. Additionally, after graduating from high school, language majority students may no longer use their second language as they acquired. Alright, policy recommendations and conclusions. Significant progress has been made in the past 50 years in terms of equal educational opportunity for ELLs. However, there is still substantial room for improvement in the bilingual education system. Observers often point to the gap in communication between the research and policy communities. Now I'm on page 247. This is reflected in the discrepant ways in which the two communities label the population of language minority children. The official label used by the federal government is LEP, as previously mentioned. This focuses on skills the child is lacking rather than what positive aspects the child might bring to the situation. The research community prefers more objective labels such as ELL or DLL that focus on additive bilingualism. However, these labels have not yet made their way into mainstream policy culture. There's also not a standard definition of bilingual education. 5 approaches to the education of ELLs were described in this paper: submersion, ESL/ESOL instruction, transitional bilingual education, maintenance bilingual education, and TWI. However, the programs and services in place for ELLs do not always fit neatly into one of these 5 categories for all school districts around the country. Some school districts may use a combination of the programs described earlier. There are no federal standards for the best method for educating ELLs. If federal standards were put into place, states could begin to take more action to help their local school districts implement educational services. Further, it appears that the TWI model is a very effective method for educating both language minority and language majority students. However, achieving this style of education for all ELLs is a lofty goal. The government must first ensure that no language minority students is lost in the system, and that all ELLs are receiving at least some level of services, even if it is simply ESL only pull-out instruction. This could be achieved by requiring states to more closely monitor the kinds of services ELLs are receiving in their school districts. In addition, more rigorous research on TWI programs is needed. As mentioned earlier, appropriately matched control groups are needed to increase both the internal validity and generalizability of results. The model of a social policy experiment is recommended as a way to examine the effectiveness of these programs. A social policy experiment is a research design in which individual participants or households or schools are randomly assigned to experience different regulations or incentives in order to test policy level interventions. Different classrooms could be assigned to different types of bilingual education programs, and the children could be followed longitudinally for at least 2 years with measurements of academic performance taken at regular intervals. The Institute of Education Science or another similar federal agency could, for example, advertise a call for research proposals on this topic. And one of the main obstacles to the wider use of TWI programs is the lack of qualified teachers. To resolve this issue, a foreign exchange program could be implemented between the United States and countries of the language minority children present in the classroom. This program would involve bringing qualified teachers from their native country to the United States for an internship experience. Families of children in the school could volunteer to host visiting teachers for the course of the academic year with some kind of compensation provided by the federal or state government. In return, these teachers would receive the opportunity to learn additional English skills, if desired. One such program was devised and implemented in Dalton, Georgia in 1996 as a response to rapidly increased numbers of children from Spanish language backgrounds in the community. Community leaders in Dalton collaborated locally with Dalton Public Schools and internationally with the University of Monterrey in Mexico to bring native-speaking Spanish teachers into the Dalton school system. Alright, and I'm on page 248 now. This is the last page. Additionally, teachers from Dalton had the opportunity to spend a summer in Mexico, taking part in an institute designed to teach them more about Hispanic culture and basic Spanish language skills. Over 200 teachers participated in the project from 1997 to 2007. One assessment of the program concluded that the Georgia project stood as a promising, multifaceted attempt to confront multiple obstacles that have limited Hispanic school success and socioeconomic mobility elsewhere. Other exchange programs for teachers also exist in the country, such as the Fulbright Teacher Exchange Program. Cooperation with language agencies or teaching agencies, including both local agencies and state or federal level agencies, such as Teach for America or Defense Language Institute Foreign Language Center, could also facilitate the development of more TWI programs. Exchanging resources with the teacher's native countries, such as textbooks in the native language, would also be an option to consider. This could promote international cooperation between countries and also help language minority students receive equal educational opportunities. In conclusion, despite its limitations and the need for more rigorous studies, TWI programs currently appear to be an effective model for helping ELLs to become proficient in English, while at the same time retaining valuable first language skills. Additionally, native English speakers in these programs are also provided with the opportunity to become bilingual. Indeed, there is a global trend towards second language acquisition. Citizens in several other countries, for example, Canada, Germany, Scotland, Australia, learn one language from birth and then begin second language instruction during formal schooling. Some countries even require their children to learn a second or third language. In Luxembourg, for instance, French, German, and I don't know how to pronounce this, Luxembourgish are recognized as national languages, and almost all the citizens are trilingual. An increasing number of elementary and secondary schools in the United States offer instruction to students in foreign languages with targeted goals set at advanced levels of oral and written proficiency by the end of the secondary schooling. In 2008, Cal surveyed more than 5,000 secondary and elementary schools, both public and private, to learn more about the availability of foreign language instruction on a national scale. They found that foreign languages were being taught in about 1 in the 4 elementary schools, a 6% decrease from 1997. About 58% of the secondary schools were teaching foreign languages, which was also less than that in 1997, when it was 75%. In elementary schools that had foreign language programs, Spanish and French were by far the most common languages taught, with 88% and 11% of schools respectively, followed by Spanish for Spanish speakers, German, etc. For secondary schools that had foreign language programs, 93% offered Spanish and 46% offered French. Despite these encouraging figures, Cal concluded that native English-speaking students in the United States are still too limited in opportunities to continue foreign language education for enough years to gain full communicative skills in a foreign language. The United States is concerned with its standing in the global market, but remains less concerned with providing children with the foreign language tools necessary to be competitive in that market. The United States needs to adopt the philosophy of teaching all children a second language from kindergarten through 12th grade, not just language minority students or students who actively seek a foreign language class. Now I'm on page 249 for the last sentence. Such changes would likely be beneficial for all students and especially for those learning English.